All right, so I am going to talk about individuality, viability, and goal-directedness in biology. In fact, I'm going to spend at least 20 minutes on individuality in general, and then probably 10 minutes or less on the rest. That's because this turned out to be the very first talk, so it seemed to make more sense to spend time on introduction and background to give you some context for the symposium. So I'm currently at the University of Hertfordshire, but a lot of this, as Sean said, I was here at ELSI for a long time, and a lot of this is the result of being here and interacting with people here over that time. So just to begin with, or the first whole part of the talk is a sort of perspective on individuality, and the first thing I want to say, and probably the most important thing, is that individuality as a concept has been reinvented many times by biology over the history of life. So a biological cell, a bacterial cell is maybe the first obvious example of an individual. Bacteria live individually, they reproduce individually, they interact with, they're separate from their environment and they interact with it. Eukaryotic cells are very similar, of course, but they're much larger and more complicated and differently organized. Perhaps you could see these as quite similar, but then when we think about multicellular organisms, that's really a reinvention of the concept of individuality. A worm lives individually, it reproduces individually, it's separate from its environment, it has all the same sort of properties that we intuitively make us want to see it as an individual, yet it's made of individual cells that in some sense are still their own individuals. And then you have individuality at higher levels, such as this is meant to be a termite mound. Eusocial insect colonies can in many ways be seen as an individual in their own right, while also being made up of many individual insects. We'll see that in a little bit more detail later on. So this observation is the basis of the book, The Major Transitions in Evolution, which is kind of all about this reinvention of the concept of individuality across biology, and one of the authors will give a recorded talk later. So another point I want to make is that we ourselves happen to be extremely complicated multicellular animals, and for us, because of the way our biology works, individuality is very strong. It tends to be all or nothing, right? I'm one person and you're a different person, and there's very little scope for confusion about where one of us ends and the other begins. At least, you know, if we know each other very well, that might happen on the mental level, but on the physical level, it can't really, because we're so separate from each other. But that isn't true across biology. So even something simple as vegetatively propagating plants, it's kind of hard to say where one individual ends and another one begins, right? So if you walk through a bamboo grove, the bamboo stalks are all connected under the ground by a rhizome. So in a sense, they're all genetically identical. In a sense, they're all part of a single individual. But if you were to build a road through the middle of the bamboo grove and cut all the rhizomes in half, it wouldn't really care that much. If you take a cutting and grow another clone somewhere else, it will be genetically identical, but you probably wouldn't want to say it was the same individual. So even in plants, individuality is a bit more blurry than it is in animals. And there are these other famous examples that you surely already know about. Many species of slime mold can live as individual eukaryotic cells, but at a certain point in their life cycle will come together to form what's effectively a single cell with many nuclei that may then grow into a fruiting body and then disperse many individual cells again to continue the life cycle. Siphonophores like the Portuguese man of war. I would say are individual animals, like there are lots of people, it's often said that they are colonies of many animals rather than a single animal. I would say it actually is a single animal, but in its evolutionary history, it used to be a colony of many animals. And because of that, the kind of components of it, the sail and various parts of the tentacles, have the properties of they have their own individual nervous system and something resembling a digestive system. You as a human being aren't like that. Your heart and your liver don't resemble organisms, but still they're quite individuated. They're very different things from each other. And in a different sense, you are a colony, you're co-adapted with your gut bacteria, you could probably survive without them, but you'd definitely be worse off. So in some sense, you're not even a single species. And then, yeah, continuing with these examples where individuality is blurry, this institute has an identity of its own. It has an interface it presents to the world. You can email it and get a response. In some respects, ELSI behaves as an individual, but it's part of a larger institute as well, and also has people within it who have their own identities. So individuality can be blurry and can overlap. And yeah, you might say this isn't a biological example, but we are humans and we're biology, and it's part of human behavior, so it actually kind of is, in some sense. And then, yeah, individuality isn't just about genetics. There are lots of mechanisms through which genes can be transferred between individuals. Bacteria can transfer plasmids between each other. Viruses can transfer genes across lineages and so on. So individuality is a blurry and indistinct concept. And actually that makes complete sense. Because if individuality is the sort of thing that can be reinvented by biology, you should really expect it to be something of a sliding scale. You ought to be able to have some kind of exaptation that will take you part of the way to forming a new kind of individual, such that evolution can then guide the process further on. So yeah, this is kind of repeating a point I already made, but I think it's important again. It's easy for us as complex multicellular organisms to think of individuality as really fundamental to what it is to be alive, right? You will often, when people try to define what life is, they will often invoke the concept of individuality. But that might just be a trick of perspective. That's how it is for us and the species that are closely related to us that we know how to selectively breed, but it isn't actually true necessarily across the whole biosphere. So that's like a kind of, that's going to come back later as well. It's a kind of point about, is individuality really part of life, or is it merely a repeating theme across the biosphere? So I want to make a distinction between two different aspects of individuality that we might often want to talk about, because I think they're both really important, the genetic aspect and the physical aspect. I wanted to make the distinction mostly because I'm very interested in the physical aspect of individuality, but it's not really separate from the genetic aspect, and I kind of want to give some background on them and explain how they relate. So the genetic aspect of individuality is often talked about in terms of within group versus between group selection within evolutionary biology. So the example to have in mind, I'm not going to give you a mathematical model, I'm just going to give you the concept, but it can easily be made into a mathematical model. The example to have in mind is that we have some kind of species, and within that species, there exist two different types that can be inherited, two different phenotypes that can be inherited. And these animals, or whatever they are, they live in groups, and they reproduce in groups. And the idea is that the blue ones, the blue circles, are going to be really good at cooperating with each other to help the group survive, whereas the red squares are going to be kind of selfish. They take advantage of what the blue ones provide, but they don't provide anything back to the group in return. And because of that, they will have the property that if your group has lots of red squares in it, it will not reproduce very much. However, within a single group, the red squares will reproduce faster than the blue circles. So what happens is that if you have a group with lots of altruistic blue circles and a few selfish red squares, it will initially do really well, reproduce a lot, have lots of offspring groups. However, within each of those groups, the proportion of red squares will increase, and eventually you'll end up with these less fit groups that are composed only of the selfish red squares, even though at the group level, the ones with the blue circles in them are better. So this was a classic result in evolutionary theory. People used to think that group selection could explain all sorts of things, but then people came along with mathematical models and realized that no, that's not true. Not because group selection doesn't exist, it absolutely does, but because this within group selection tends to be a much stronger force. Things really have to be just right for group selection to actually make a difference in evolution. But wait a second, we as individuals are made of many cells. We are a group in many ways. How come we seem to be selected at the group level? Well, that's because biology has solved this problem of within-group selection. The germline, or every cell in your body, is descended from a single fertilized egg. And because of that, even if you do have a mutation that causes a lineage of cells to outcompete the other cells, if that's bad enough, it might kill you, and we would call it cancer. But because your children will only inherit what was in the germline, they will not inherit those cells. So the germline forces all of your cells to be very closely related to each other, which gives them a common interest, prevents them from being able to compete. And so the major transitions in evolution often have the flavor of centralizing information flow. And if you're interested in individuality from the evolutionary, the genetic perspective, this will be very likely the sort of thing that you will be focused on, is understanding the information flow through the individual. But there's also the very interesting physical aspect of individuality. Why do we have groups in the first place? How does the physical structure of an organism come to be? Where does that come from? And I think there's probably lots of answers to that question. I hope we'll hear some during the conference. But the two obvious ones that come to mind are economies of scale and division of labor. So economies of scale just means that it may be more efficient to have things happening all in the same place, as opposed to spread out everywhere. Division of labor means that once you do have things all in one place, you can have some cells doing one job and some cells doing another job, and that can be much better than having all of them do all of the jobs. But the really interesting thing is that once you've got this stuff going on, it can enable completely new ways to find a niche in the world that couldn't possibly have existed before. So this is supposed to illustrate that if you were a group of billions of individual cells instead of a single multicellular organism, there would be no way that you could survive by going out and earning money and spending it on ramen, right? To do that, you need at least a brain and a digestive tract. And those are things that you could only have by being a complex and structured organism. So, okay, I'll go into a little bit more detail. There's this very famous idea called autopoiesis by these authors called Majorana and Varela, and I don't necessarily agree with everything they write, but I find it a good way to start thinking about biology and the notion of individual. So what they were doing was they believed, which I don't really believe, but they believed that life was very special and that there was a special distinguishing property that life had that made it different from non-life, and they were trying to define what that was. So this term autopoietic machine is their word for organism, and they said that we should think of an organism as a network of processes that produces the components that continuously regenerate and realize the network of processes that produce them. So there's two things going on here. We've got processes and we've got components, and the processes produce the components, and the components enable the processes to happen, so that you've got this kind of feedback loop. Like all the processes in my body are producing all the physical stuff in my body, and that physical stuff is causing all those processes to keep happening. And it's kind of interesting that they say the organism is the network of processes, right? But it kind of makes sense, because the physical stuff you're made of is changing all the time. The thing that stays constant over time is the processes that happen that produce that physical stuff. So they say this, and they say that the organism, that this network of processes constitutes the machine as a concrete unity, which I've never really understood exactly what they mean by that, but I think it's something very similar to the idea of an individual, right? That these processes aren't just happening everywhere, they're happening in one place, and that matters. And so for a long time I've said that so I tend to interpret this idea slightly differently than the original authors, but I think that's okay. And so for a long time I've said that this idea of this network of processes should include processes that happen at a higher level than chemistry, and sometimes even processes that take place outside the organism. And so maybe a good example of that is the termite mound that I mentioned previously. So why is it a big mound? Well, it's a big mound. The termites don't live inside the mound. The mound has a chimney in it, and the chimney is there because of airflow. So I thought I understood how this works, and then I looked into it, and maybe I didn't really understand how it works. But it has to do with airflow, and the reason it's there is because the termites are farming fungus in the central chamber, and so you've got to keep the conditions just right so that you can continue to grow fungus in this central chamber all year round. And the point is that this airflow process isn't something that the termites are doing. Right? The termites built the physical mound, and then within the mound there are these airflow processes, and those processes are part of this like big complicated network of processes that keeps this whole thing going, but they are not something that's happening inside the termites. It's not something that the termites are directly doing. So if we want to see this kind of individual as a network of processes, it includes processes that are not kind of straightforwardly biological in nature, in some sense. Now, another thing I've said for years and years is that physical individuality of this kind isn't really unique to biology at all. So a typhoon is also a complicated network of processes that constitutes itself as an individual in some sense. And I won't go into detail about this, but you can find analogues of anatomy and development and homeostasis and all the rest looking at storm systems. And so what the reason I want to mention this here is that it suggests that maybe the formation of complex individuals per se is not difficult, right? We might think of the origin of multicellular organisms, for example, as being something that requires a massive, very difficult innovation in biology, but perhaps it's not, because physics kind of wants to form complex individuals for free anyway, and biology just has to fine-tune it. There's a story that can be told here about the origin of individuality, but because it's kind of just a metaphor, I think I'm going to skip through it mostly. The point is just that when you think through how storm systems actually form in the first place, this kind of developmental process that occurs, you realize that the formation of individuals is more like a reorganization of processes that are already happening. Right? The formation of a storm system is part of the Earth's mechanism for dissipating the temperature gradients in the ocean. So the storm isn't this kind of special thing that comes into existence out of nowhere. It's a natural outcome of physical processes that dissipate heat. And so perhaps that is something we would expect to see a lot in biology as well, that the formation of individuals isn't a magical new innovation that occurs. It's a reorganization of processes that are already happening in the biosphere. Previously they were happening everywhere, now they're happening just in one place. And then once that does happen, it might necessitate further changes, such as the genetic bottleneck. Right? It's more efficient to have things in one place, but then you have to deal with within-group competition, and evolution has to innovate something like the germline to get around that, and then enables all sorts of other things. So now I'm going to try and, that was all kind of very general stuff for context for the meeting. Now I'm going to try and get towards the recent work that I've done. So there are two things that individuality often means, and it kind of means both of them at the same time. One is that an individual is distinct from its environment, and another one is that an individual is distinct from other individuals. And I'm not going to say very much about this. I'm just mentioning it because this is the important one for what follows. But it has to do, both of these have to do with which processes are coupled to which other ones. So if my heart stops, then my cells will stop respiring, but your cells won't. And that's what makes me a separate individual from you in some sense, right? The processes within our bodies have, within my body, share the same fate. If I die, they all stop. And I kind of feel like that's an important point. So yeah, homeostasis. After they've defined autopoiesis as a network of processes, Maturana and Varela write, therefore, which is questionable, but therefore an autopoietic machine is a homeostatic system that has its own organization as the fundamental variable which it maintains constant. So they're saying, so homeostasis is the ability of organisms to maintain things like their temperature within ranges that will keep them alive. And they're saying, in some sense, homeostasis is all there is to life. An organism is a system that wants to stay alive, is maintaining the fact that it is alive. That's not unique to biology either in some sense, but evolution gives living systems something that physical systems don't really often seem to have, which is the ability to anticipate the future. So this bird already has wings, even though it's still in the egg. And why is that? It's because in the future, if everything goes right with its developmental process, it will be able to use those wings to fly. And yes, that's a teleological story. Yes, you can tell a non-teleological version, but all the same, wings are for flying. So my recent work is on the topic of what does it mean for a system to reach toward a goal and how does it relate to homeostasis. And the work that I'm trying to get towards is published in various papers with these co-authors. Martin and Manuel are here somewhere, so you can say hello to them if you want. The work is very mathematical, and I'm only giving a super vague overview, and I hope it will make sense anyway. So there is a classic theorem, or classic paper anyway, in control theory, the title of the paper is Every Good Regulator of a System Must Be a Model of That System, and that's kind of a weird and striking claim if you ask me, but what they want to say is that if you're building a control system, so you've got some system that you want to control, like a power plant or something like that, you're building a control system and you want to make sure that your power plant's temperature doesn't get too high or too low. They want to say that your controller must somehow be able to model, to predict the behavior of the power plant in order to be able to counter what it might do. Now, the maths in the paper is kind of questionable, but there are various other works that descend from it that kind of fix the issues. Our theorem is inspired by this, but it's something new. Our theorem says something very similar to this, but it applies to dynamically coupled systems. I'll say what that is shortly. It applies to self-regulating systems of the kind I've been describing, organisms that have to regulate themselves rather than controllers that regulate some external thing. It ends up having a nice, more modern, more Bayesian notion of model than the original Conant and Ashby paper. And it avoids ontological commitments by being explicitly as if. So the philosophy of Daniel Dennett ends up being very relevant to the maths. I won't really talk about that much, but in my opinion, it's very important. So what do we mean by coupled systems? Well, if you want to model something mathematically, generally you sort of have to split it up into chunks, right? So we're going to take this nice, smooth, continuous world that doesn't really have individuals in it at all, except in a vague and undefined sense, as I tried to emphasize earlier. But we have to kind of take part of that world and say, this is the part that we're thinking of as an agent, and the rest is what we're thinking of as the environment. So there's this sort of act of individuation that we as observers have to do in order to model anything that's maybe somewhat different from the formation of actual individuals. Anyway, we're going to take this whole thing and model it as a coupled pair of dynamical systems, and there's lots of ways that one could do that. So the point is that these dynamical systems only interact via their interface. So once you've got this situation where you've got these two systems that interact, what could it mean for one of them to model the other one? I'm not going to even try to give you any mathematical details, but the idea is that you should have a map, a function, that takes the state of one system and tells you what that system is supposedly thinking about the other system in the form of, for example, a Bayesian prior or a bunch of logical expressions, however you want to model the agent's beliefs about the other system. And for these to be beliefs, or a model, they should update according to Bayes' rule or some other rule along those lines, right? So if I'm modeling something, I might have a prior over its state. If I get some new information, I will update that prior to a posterior. And you want this map from states of the system to belief states. You want this map to have the property that as the system's actual physical state changes over time, as it interacts with the other system, its beliefs will change over time according to what Bayes' theorem tells you they should do, right? And if you have a map of that kind, that's what we're going to call a model. So suppose we have two coupled systems, our agent and our environment, and suppose that the agent is able to perform a regulation task. What do I mean by that? Well, that can either be this classic control theory idea where you have a desired set of states for the environment. So here the autopilot is the controller, the aeroplane is the environment. You don't care about the state of the controller, you care about whether the aeroplane is flying level or not. And as long as it is, then everything's okay. So the agent state doesn't really matter, the environment state does matter, and so the acceptable states for the combined system are a rectangle like that. But it could also be a situation like biological homeostasis, where the controller is actually the thing you do care about. So the organism, this lizard, wants to control its body temperature, but to do that it has to interact with its environment, it has to find the right rocks to sit on at the right times of day. And so because of that, you have an acceptable range for the agent state. The environment doesn't matter except as much as it matters to the agent to be able to maintain itself. And the point is that although that sounds really excessively simple, it actually isn't, and we'll see why shortly. So, and interestingly, this idea also goes back to W. Ross Ashby. He's the same Ashby as Conant and Ashby. Yes, so either way, whether we're doing control theory or biology, either way we end up with a subset of the, so we've got the state space of the environment and the agent, and we've got a subset of the Cartesian product of those that we call the good set. But we also have, because these are dynamical systems, we also have dynamics. So here I've drawn that as a vector field, saying that whatever state the combined system is in, right? So each point is a state of both the system and its environment. Whatever state this combined system's in, there's a direction it will move. And we're going to say it's a good regulator, so it can do its regulation task. If there are some states, doesn't have to be all of them, if there are some states where if you start in those states, you will never leave the good set, right? Because that means it's possible for the system to continue being alive, to perform its homeostasis. And yeah, there may be some states where you do leave the good set, but that doesn't matter. We don't mind that those exist as long as some of the blue ones do. So the blue region is all the states where that's true, where you won't leave the green set, and we're going to call that the regulating set. And an important fact about this is that even if the good set is something very simple, this rectangles that I showed you earlier, the regulating set can be very complicated. So the need to engage with the environment gives rise to this complexity. Like in some sense, the fact that the blue set is something complicated tells you that this agent has to engage with its environment in a complicated way in order to perform its regulation task. And that seems like a very important point about individuality in general as well, that when we become individuals, when we separate ourselves off from the environment, we still have to engage with it. We don't just separate from it and sit there happily by ourselves. Yeah. So what does the theorem say? Well, it's actually incredibly simple. We just form this set, which says that when I look at a state of the agent, there are certain states of its environment that are kind of within the blue set, right? So if my agent's in this state, the environment might be here, it might be here, it might be here, it might be here. And the point is that if the environment isn't in one of those states, then the agent's already failed because it's eventually going to leave the green region, right? So the theorem just basically says you define that set, and then that is an interpretation map. You can see it in terms of this diagram. It does update according to some sort of logical version of Bayes' rule. So yeah, that's the result. Then there's all sorts of interesting things that kind of come after that result. So yeah, just to restate it, yeah, this is kind of related to stuff from inactive cognitive science that I haven't really talked about. But there's this idea that precariousness, which is basically the ability to die, kind of creates meaning for the individual. Things in the environment have meaning for the individual because they are relevant for the individual to do what it's trying to do, i.e. not die and reproduce. And so this theorem is basically saying that, and it's allowing us to trace mathematically what this meaning is and where it comes from and how it relates to the precariousness, or at least that's one way to think about it. But the observer has to make some choices, right? So this comes for free in a sense, but it doesn't come completely for free because it comes at the cost of having to make decisions. So this classic paper by Clark and Chalmers, The Extended Mind, features this guy who has a poor memory, and he writes a lot of things down in his notebook. And if we model that in this way, we can choose, do we draw the boundary to exclude the notebook so it's in the environment, or do we draw the boundary to include the notebook so that it's part of the agent? And the point is that you can do either of those things, and they both make sense, and you simply get different answers about what this agent believes. So different choices lead to different results, and I think there's a lot more to say on this slightly weird question of where is the boundary of an individual, right? Because that's not obvious in biology, like it's not really defined. If I breathe in, does the air become part of me as soon as it's in my lungs, or when it's dissolved in my blood, or when it starts to participate in chemical reactions inside my cells? I don't think that question has an answer. And so there's this kind of weird tension between we have to draw a boundary somewhere in order to study something versus where the boundary kind of really is in nature. And like I say, there's a lot more that could be said about that, but I'm going to wrap up. Yeah, also, where's the boundary in this example? So to wrap up, I want to come back to a question that I've thought about for years and years and years, I come back to all the time. What kind of transition is the origin of life? So the Earth at some point in time didn't have any life, and it was very complex. And in that state, you can maybe say nothing matters, right? It's very complex, but there's nothing matters to anything because nothing wants anything. There's nothing that has, nothing that's trying to do anything, right? But in the modern world today, after the origin of life, there are lots of things that matter because there are lots of things that are striving and have purpose and are trying to do something in some sense. So this is one possible answer to this question. It certainly isn't the only one. But the origin of individuality, from what I've said, is very closely related to the notion of purpose and striving and trying to do things and modeling your environment and so on. And so I think it has a lot to do with this. And that, I think, is it. Thank you.